Well, we had a good season in '78. Obviously, the next season became a very important season when we could really, realistically make a bid for the championship. And we did some recruiting.
I came over with Trevor Wymart, Roger Kenyon, Ray Lewington, a lot of Brits, some of them that I knew of and I'd watched in the old First Division. I was quite excited. We were always known as the kind of British mafia. We had excellent Canadian players, Bobby Lenarduzzi and Bob Belitho, Buzz Parsons. All these players had such a big contribution to that season.
A pivotal moment took place around the halfway mark of the season when we brought in a player by the name of Alan Ball.
You could be the man to turn it around.
Well, I dearly hope so.
Who had played for England in the 1966 World Cup, and as a kid I watched that game, and all of a sudden Alan Ball, I would be playing beside Alan Ball.
Alan Ball was playing in Philadelphia. What had happened is a number of the rock stars, including Mick Jagger, had tried to replicate the New York Cosmos and bring in star players, and they didn't work out. So we were fortunate enough to be able to go there and say, can we trade Alan Ball to Vancouver? And he came in, and he was the catalyst, there was no doubt about it.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Hey now, how's it going, everybody? My name is Tim Hanlon, as announced. Thank you, Corey Coates, our dulcet-toned announcer for 4 years now. We appreciate him stepping up to the mic each and every week and announcing me flawlessly. Well, okay, it's a recording we did 4 years ago. What are you going to do? Tim Hanlon, that's the name, and Good Seats Still Available. That's the podcast, and that's the place you find yourself this week. Thanks for coming by. It is our weekly little journey, our little tour, a little excursion into what used to be in professional sports. That's our little niche. Not so little. It just continues to grow and grow and grow. And we're back into soccer again this week, and a fascinating little tale we've got for you with our guests, Rob Sawyer and David France, two of the three guys behind a brand new book about Everton. Yes, the Premier League franchise, Everton and North America. The book is called Toffee Soccer, and Toffee is obviously part of the nickname nomenclature of Everton. If you've been a fan of the team since its founding in 1878. Well known and probably the one of the more well-regarded clubs in Premier League history. Darren Griffiths is the third guy. He's not with us in this conversation, but David and Rob are, and we're going to get into their new book called Toffee Soccer, Everton and North America, and we're using it as the background for what is an unknown, really, fairly unknown, not to the naked eye, but with some investigation in our conversation this week. The legacy that is Everton soccer in Britain and its connection to the game in North America, and in particular the United States. You may know some of the modern day players that have played at Everton. Wayne Rooney, John Spencer, Mo Johnston, Tim Howard, of course, Landon Donovan. These are all mega players that have played in Major League Soccer, part of the U.S. national team in some cases. Everton, part of their lineage, and just the latest expression, the latest examples of a team that somewhat quietly has been very foundational to the game in North America. And it's also sort of an interesting set of bookmarks that we can kind of sort of put into place. Everton was part of that thing called the International Soccer League. We've sort of danced around that topic a little bit, 1960 to 1965, that being the Bill Cox run, what will you call it? International competition played largely in New York, the Polo Grounds for sure, but a little bit of Randall's Island, Montreal, a couple of other cities were part of the mix. over those years. And that was the prelude, as we've discussed in previous episodes, to the founding of what ultimately became the North American Soccer League in earnest in 1968. But two rival leagues in the year prior to that, 1967, that being the United Soccer Association and the National Professional Soccer League. And without the Bill Cox-led International Soccer League importing whole cloth major top-tier soccer franchises from all around the world, Everton was part of that mix in the 1961 competition. They almost won the whole darn thing, but it was absolutely part of the mix, and that sort of began the seeds of what became the NASL. And then, frankly, not coming back into the United States and Canada until 1985. And interestingly, an interesting time, having been here at the sort of foundational roots of what became the NASL, coming back to the United States and Canada, actually Canada, North America, let's call it North America in Canada, of course, when the league, NASL, had just literally died at the tail end of 1984. Everton came back in 1985, and then, so interesting bookmark, but in between, you could make a very strong argument that Everton was probably one of the, if not the, most prolific teams in terms of providing talent for players in the North American Soccer League. And that clip that you heard at the beginning of this little show here was a testament to one of those players, Alan Ball, well regarded and one of the sort of legendary players in Everton history, made his mark for sure in the NASL with the, I guess you could say now long lamented or perhaps oft forgotten, maybe both of those things, Philadelphia Fury in 1978. An interesting expansion franchise that we need to go deeper into at some point. Peter Frampton and Paul Simon and others in the rock and roll pantheon decided, hey, let's get into this NASL franchise ownership thing, and we'll plop this team down in Philadelphia, and we'll import all of our favorite players from England. What was it called? The Premier League at the top time, but the Division One, including our pal Alan Ball, who was a great player at Everton. Why not? It wasn't sort of all that easy and full of excitement. Certainly the crowds didn't come in great numbers, and there's a whole other sort of a context to that story. We'll get to hopefully at some point in the months ahead. But Alan Ball certainly was making a name for himself, not only with Philadelphia, but then got traded for by the Vancouver Whitecaps. And why is he important? Well, the Vancouver Whitecaps, of course, won it all in 1979 against, in the semifinals against the vaunted Cosmos. There is and then, of course, winning the Soccer Bowl in 1979 at Giant Stadium in East Rutherford, New Jersey, was supposed to be the Cosmos in there. Of course, it was not. They beat the Tampa Bay Rowdies. And not only was yours truly there, but the game before that, the week before, which is on some people's lists as the or one of the most exciting games. And I would put games in quotes only because it was, I don't know what it was. It wasn't just one game. It was a whole bunch of things. September 1st, 1979, live for 3+ hours, 3 hours and 20 minutes. On ABC Sports. That was the first year of ABC Sports' coverage of the NASL. We all know how that wound up and turned out eventually. But this game was not the problem. It was jam-packed full of excitement. The Cosmos had lost to the Vancouver Whitecaps 2-0 or 2-0 the Wednesday before this game. And as you may remember, the NASL's crazy playoff system, it was basically the best 2 out of 3, but it wasn't fully that. It was not aggregate goals. So literally it was just one loss for the Cosmos or one win for the Whitecaps going into the second and frankly, possibly third game. The second game was won by the Cosmos in a shootout. So that means that they were tied on games, 1 game to 1 game. And so they had to move on to this thing called the mini game, 30 minutes of extra fun that literally had the weight or carried the weight as a tiebreaker, as its own sort of full game, but not really a full game, just 30 minutes. That game was tied and then also went into a shootout. It was crazy. It was nuts. the Cosmos lost that shootout. And obviously the Vancouver Whitecaps went on to win that game and then the series by default, or not by default, by definition, and then went up to came back and beat the Tampa Bay Rowdies for the NASL championship that year. Alan Ball, very instrumental in that. And as you heard in that clip there, that was from a little documentary that the current Vancouver Whitecaps did back in 2019 to commemorate the 40th anniversary of that NASL championship in Vancouver and the beginnings of really that Vancouver Whitecaps name and franchise. Alan Ball, one of the, if not the main cogs in that championship season. And they knew he was a star. They knew of his prowess at Everton, and they wanted him for the Whitecaps. And lo and behold, it helped them win that vaunted NASL title for the not so tiny hamlet of Vancouver, British Columbia. But that's an example of the contributions that Everton from today's Premier League has made as an impact on the sport of soccer here in North America. And that's our conversation. We're going to get into the International Soccer League. We're going to get into a team in 1985 that was that basically took on that was the remnants of what was the Toronto Blizzard when Everton came back to tour in 1985, called NX Canada, if you remember that, for 1 year, backed by Molson Brewery. There's a little corner of forgottenness that we get into, and everything in between, which was largely the North American Soccer League and Everton's contribution to that. All that and more for a fascinating chat with our guests this week, David France and Rob Sawyer. Their book, again, called Toffee Soccer, the history. What's it called? The history? It is I'm trying to get the full name here. Everton and North America. The book is great. It's great. Even if you're not an Everton fan, it is meticulous in its detail. Every single stinking game that Everton's ever played in North America is chronicled here, including the 2009 Major League Soccer All-Star game in Sandy, Utah at Rio Tinto Stadium, which was a classic affair settled in a shootout. Every single player that had a cup of coffee with both Everton and somewhere in the United States is chronicled here. It is a very, very impressive body of work in all of its almost 560 pages. It's just fascinating to read, even if you're not an Everton fan. If you're a fan of the history of the sport of soccer in the United States and Canada, you will enjoy it very much. All that and more coming up in a few moments. Stay tuned. It's fun. It's interesting. And you will hopefully be entertained. A brand new sponsor this week. Let's kick that off, shall we? Our pal Kevin Schultz has brought to us Extra Time Vintage. ExtraTimeVintage.com. Promo code Good Seats for 15% off all of your purchases. What is it, you ask? Well, Extra Time Vintage is all about the celebration of, wait for it, defunct soccer teams. Yes, you name them, they've just about got them. There's all kinds of great teams commemorated in T-shirt and other wear form. ASL, NASL, MISL, and lots of different things in between. If you're a fan of any of the USA, the MPSL, all kinds of teams and leagues represented there. And indeed, it's Extra Time Vintage. ExtraTimeVintage.com. You want that Hartford Hellions shirt, the Cleveland Cobras hoodie? How about the sweatshirt with the Pennsylvania Stoners? Jeez, Pennsylvania Stoners of the ASL. Great stuff. It's all there for you, and it is there with a great discount for you there. The code is Good Seats at ExtraTimeVintage.com. Promo code Good Seats to get your major discount. And you'll see there's a map of the United States where all these great teams might have been domiciled in Canada. I see Denver Dynamos from the NASL hoodies. I see Washington Whips sweatshirts. I see a Team Hawaii shirt. I see an Atlanta Apollos shirt. I see all kinds of great stuff. It just goes on and on and on. And why not enjoy some discounted goodness while you're there too? Again, ExtraTimeVintage.com, our brand new sponsor this week. Promo code Good Seats for 15% off all of your purchases. Thank you to Kevin Schultz and his pals there at extratimevintage.com and for stepping up to the plate and being a new sponsor here on this little show. All right, let's get on to the festivities, shall we? Let's talk about the very interesting connection between Everton soccer in the Premier League and the modern history of the game of soccer in North America. Let's talk Toffee Soccer. Here's our conversation with Rob Sawyer and David France we had just a couple of weeks back. Please enjoy. Why don't we start there, guys? Why don't we kind of because obviously this book is amazingly comprehensive, and frankly it's a topic that encroaches on our little sort of odd area of focus, which is sort of teams and leagues and situations, et cetera, that have existed in the pro sports realm generally here in the United States, North America, that for whatever reasons don't exist anymore. And it's just a nice confluence. But I think for the maybe perhaps uninitiated American audience, although we've got a very worldwide reach, I'm astounded at the various places in Africa and Asia and in Europe that we're listened to. So who knows why? But I certainly am not. I'm certainly happy for it. Maybe you can kind of both of you in your own ways, sort of for the uninitiated, kind of sort of set up this Everton club in sort of the pantheon of, let's call it British soccer or European, wherever sort of environment you want to describe it, because the leagues obviously have names have changed and all that stuff. Because I'm not sure the maybe, shall we say, average soccer fan, right? They know the Manchester Uniteds, they know the Chelseas for lots of different reasons, the branding and all that stuff, but they may or may not be sort of as familiar with Everton and its very rich history. Maybe a little 101 for our audience as to sort of its history and maybe how they've gotten to where they are right now in the Premier League solidly.
Can I take this, Rob?
Go ahead.
Everton were one of the founder members of the Football League back in 1888, one of the 12 founding members. Since that time, or shortly after that time, they were responsible for many of the innovations in football, such as goal nets, such as a purpose-built football stadium. They were the first to do that. They were first to publish a football program. And therefore, they have been, as I said, one of the pillars of English soccer. They've won 9 First Division championships, but more important than that, they have played 118 seasons in the top flight. Now, that number in itself doesn't mean much, but it's 22 more seasons than Manchester United, 26 more than City, 32 more than Tottenham and Chelsea. So this is a club with an illustrious history. As for its players, it had Dixie Dean, who was the Babe Ruth of soccer in the 30s. You know, his record of 60 goals in one season, one league season, has yet to be broken.
So a real durability, right? So maybe not sort of, dozens and dozens of championships and all that, certainly having success along the way. But that durability, which is, I think, lost on certainly the North American fandom, right? Because this whole promotion relegation thing, right? There is a fight literally every year to not only succeed and win cups and championships, but also to stay in that top tier, even as that's morphed and modernized over time, right? So, the fact that Everton is literally and figuratively essentially always been there, right, is itself a feat of durability and longstanding.
It's a tremendous feat. When you talk about titles, cups, silverware, you must remember that Everton had some dreadful luck in their history, in that they've never had a dynasty. Most successful sports teams have a dynasty of a decade or so. You can look at Arsenal, Liverpool, Manchester United. They've had them in recent years. When Everton had their best teams, something happened in the world, such as in 1914-15, the First World War broke out. In 1938-39, the Second World War broke out. And in 1985, of course, we were banned from Europe for no fault of our own. And that set us back significantly.
Rob, how do you sort of describe the team of late in sort of the modern day game, right? Because they're obviously still competitive, and we're going to obviously get into some interesting overlaps in the United States and stuff, because it's pretty clear, right? Given that durability, given that solid performance, that long-standing track record, right? It's going to, as we get into it in a few minutes, it's going to seem obvious that an Everton's going to be part of the, shall we say, American domestication of the game, although that's a loaded term, right? But when tours come and the United States becomes more aware and open and interested in the game, right? It only stands to reason that at Everton would be one of the first calls for the teams to come to the States to showcase the game and or sprinkle some seeds that, as time went on, would grow into some stuff here.
Yeah, sure. I mean, Everton, as David has touched on, we're still, I think, counted amongst the aristocracy of football here in the United Kingdom. The misfortune is that since 1995, we haven't actually put our hands on any silverware. And probably for a period, we were considered sort of a plucky Everton, punching above our weight through much of the 2000s on a relative shoestring budget. And I do stress the relative. Compared to some other teams, and doing better than maybe our players would suggest that we would do. In the past 5 years, we've actually come into a relatively large amount of money through our new benefactor, Mr. Mashiri. Unfortunately, that hasn't been matched with the actual delivery on the pitch. So it's probably fair to say that at the moment we're punching below our weight. These past few years, we've gone through several managers, periods of instability. But we now do have a world-class manager, a world-renowned manager in Carlo Ancelotti. But we're still sort of trying to pick up the pieces from probably 5 years of mismanagement in terms of the purchases we've made, and we're trying to live with that and reshape the team. So I think, as David said, we're sort of hovering around the 7th, 8th position, might creep into the sort of second-tier European competition next year. But we've still got some way to go to get anywhere near sort of challenging those teams at the very top.
But it's also interesting, and this is sort of let's skate into sort of the overlap here for our mutual interests, right? Because if you could pick one British / UK domiciled team, however the political and geographical demarcations have waxed and waned over the decades and centuries, right? In terms of its perhaps maybe unheralded influence of the game here in the United States, which is very complex for sure. But as we're going to highlight in a few minutes, Everton has been, and frankly, probably the seeds of this book, right? Which I think to the uninitiated would be kind of like a revelation, which frankly, me as a soccer fan of the United States variety, which is rare and masochistic. I guess the question really is, how has Everton become such an influential part of the North American game? Because I think, once you scratch the surface, there are a lot of folks, like today, like the Tim Howards and the Landon Donovans and the Wayne Rooneys, the John Spencers. I mean, these are names that, have made quite some significant contributions to the game in the United States. But when you look back, as we will in a moment, I'm just flabbergasted, frankly, by just how essential, if you will, the Everton team has been to making various goes, and some of them today, of the game on a professional level in the United States actually succeed.
If I can answer that one, Tim. Well, as you may know, we've toured North America on 10 occasions. We've played 35 games there in the post-war era. We have invited, we've had 2 North American teams play Everton at Everton. One was the Columbus Crew behind closed doors, and another one was the Canadians, which was a touring team in, I think it was 1891. We have our former players have represented something like 150 American sides, and they've coached 60 American sides. So there's been a tremendous influence of old Everton players coming to the United States. I think 10 of them are in the different halls of fame. And of course, and the other way, the contribution that North America has made to Everton has been some of the great players that we've had. We always pick the two faces of American soccer, which is Landon Donovan, who I think we all regard at Everton as being, the greatest US-born player, and then the face of America, which of course is Tim Howard, who I think we regard as a national hero.
Well, I mean, I think it's also interesting that you're bringing the sort of two-way nature of this up, right? I would argue only until fairly recently, right? The dynamic has been much more one way. That is the importation of what Everton and its system and its players and its coaches could and did bring to the United States and North America generally. But what you're referencing is, and maybe this is also a byproduct of some of those early, shall we say, exploits here, is the maturation of the game. Still a long way to go, fair disclosure, right? Of the game in the United States, and the products that are sort of coming out of this country, finally, long overdue, I would argue, and making a mark in the European game, right? I mean, we've seen it with Christian Pulisic. We've seen it with, just a myriad of players, right? Tim Howard, obviously got his start in the pro ranks with MLS here in the United States, but truly made his game literally world class by going overseas, playing with Everton, and then helping the United States to at least, hang tight, if you will, on sort of the more international stage, right? So this has become much more of a two-way kind of street now, I would imagine.
Yes, we've had 15 Canadian, USA players involved at Everton. Some of them have come for trials, like Greg Bernhauser, and he was not successful. Others like Bruce Wilson, the famous Canadian player, he came and he was offered a contract, but he decided to return to Canada. And then if you think about Brian McBride and Preki and Joe Maxwell, and I'm sure there are others that has escaped me. There's been a tremendous contribution made by American players, if they're good enough, at Everton.
Yeah, and all those players that you just mentioned, right? Standouts in the early days of MLS here in the United States, right? Which is, 25 years, quote unquote, strong. But those are foundational players that literally gave the basis for, upon which today's league is still growing and thriving.
Yeah, we currently have a young goalkeeper who I guess is third or fourth choice, Nick Hansen, is from Florida, and he came to Everton at 16. There seems to be now that American players are skipping the college route, and they're going at 17, 18, joining European clubs. Normally outside of the UK, I think Hansen's the only one that we've taken so far.
Yeah, and Rob, again, this is as well in this. This is also a two-way street on that front too, right? Because Everton is, I believe, making more of a brand expansion, shall we say? In the U.S., we've seen plenty of British clubs, European clubs making inroads here in the United States, say at the youth level, the club level, the expansion of, say, a Man City into, shall we call them, franchises in other leagues, like in Australia and the New York City F.C. franchise in MLS. I got to think that Everton's going a little deeper, or will consider to do so, in reverse, shall we say, here to the States.
Yeah, maybe some would argue slightly belatedly. We are making a concerted effort as a club, I think, to have a greater presence in the USA. I'm sure if it hadn't been for COVID, we'd have been touring again last summer over in the States. And we've had the announcements recently of us looking to set up a US office, making an appointment for somebody to actually promote the club, and some affiliations, I think, with youth soccer. Looking beyond the North America, we've had tie-ups with clubs in Ireland and Chile. So you would like to think that there is moves afoot to maybe have a tie-in with a club in North America in the coming years. I think the club's also trying to reach out to supporters. There was a successful event that David actually made an appearance on online a couple of weeks ago, an Everton in the USA event, which brought together supporters clubs from across North America, hosted from the UK by the club. So clearly, maybe some would argue belatedly, the club has realised that North America, in particular the USA, is a market to tap into, and the ties, can be strengthened. So it will be interesting to see how that develops in the next 12 to 24 months.
Yeah, and look, you could also there's a genuineness there. There's a heritage, right? As we're going to get into in sort of one of the zones of that, right? There's an authenticity of the Everton brand as it becomes more known here in the States, because as this book exhaustively gets into, there are so many threads of Everton's influence in this game in the United States, not just as a team that tours, right, which is relatively easy and almost cynical to do, right? But beyond that, in terms of the players and the influences and the continued contributions of that that play and of that brand that may or may not be known by people outside the game. So I think in some respects you have almost a built-in advantage as that brand gets more nourished here, shall we say, in that you can go literally decade by decade, all the way back into the earliest of days when it was a professionally attempted in this country, that Everton and its influence was part of it.
Yeah. David, I'm sure you want to come in, but I'd just say that you're absolutely right, Tim. And I'm sure we'll come on to talking about some players, footballers who've come over to the States and maybe done a couple of seasons. But I think the research that this book has drawn out is just how many people with an Everton connection have actually made North America their home and have been great advocates for like their mother club, for Everton, over the decades, going all the way back to, the early times of the sort of 20th century. A great player like Sam Chedzoy, who settled in Canada and was entered into their Hall of Fame there. So it's not just the players who've come over a couple of years, but there's a whole number of people that we've come across through the book research and spoken to who have made the States their home, but have always been there to blow the trumpet for Everton. David, I don't know if you've got anything you'd like to add on that.
Well, if I can go back to talking about the market, Everton in the US market, I can only there's so much competition, again, not just against the Premier League clubs, but the European giants such as Real Madrid and Barcelona, that realistically Everton can only be a niche club. When we surveyed the current Everton fans, US-based Everton fans, why they selected Everton, because Rob and myself and Darren, who is the other co-author of the book, we were born Evertonians, but the new generation have actually picked the club. The reasons why they picked the club is because they're not Liverpool and they're not Manchester United and they're not Chelsea. And the second reason is because of the rich history of the club, because we know that North Americans love history. But more important, the third one is the values of the club. Everton do a tremendous amount of work in the local community, and I think is admired throughout the British game for its work in the community.
Well, let's talk about some of that history, because the one area that I kind of lasered in on, and I think is a nice sort of scene set for the the sort of framing of the rest of this conversation, is this interesting sort of, I guess primordial is what I would call it here in the United States, although that's not really true, because there had been a number of different professional soccer leagues attempted with various levels of success over the years prior to this point. But I think most modern fans of the game here in the States would sort of recognize that the dawn of what ultimately became the North American Soccer League in the late 1960s was really sort of the birth, if you will, of the modern era. But the primordialness of that, the antecedent of that, the sort of tributary to that, one of the big tributaries, was this thing called the International Soccer League. Now, we've discussed it on a number of different episodes, and it was a sort of a fascinating sort of attempt to kind of bring professional top-tier soccer to the United States, but as still exists today, really born off the back of I guess you could call it an exhibition competition of sorts, but in many respects, it also had very competitive elements. Maybe you can kind of give us a sense of Everton circa 1960-61 when they were selected, or maybe they sought inclusion in this thing called the International Soccer League in 1961. You've got some great discussion around like sort of what was happening, but I'm not sure, based on your writings but based on what we know, that the team, the club, the organization kind of exactly knew what they were getting into by being included in this summertime tournament in the United States.
Let me tell you about our involvement in this. I gather that Bill Cox, who was the owner of the Philadelphia Phillies, it was his brainchild.
Correct.
And he brought teams over from Europe, Canada, South America, Mexico. It started in 1960 and it lasted for about 5 years, and it collapsed. And of course, it led eventually to the formation of the NASL. It was structured in 2 sections. Each year it was structured in 2 sections. There were 8 teams in each section. They played the first section in May, and then after that it was in series. The second section played, and then they came back in August and had a final between the 2 champion teams. It was financially rewarding. It was a success financially. Everton were guaranteed £2,500 per game, which was quite a lot of money back then. But as you said, the new manager, Everton had just changed manager, and they brought in Harry Catterick, who was a very successful manager. And Rob wrote his biography, which is another fascinating book. Harry Catterick wasn't keen on this at all. He'd only had the job for a month or so, and the thought of an extra 5 weeks, the competition lasted for 5 weeks at the end of a grueling season, wasn't what he was looking forward to. Anyway, the contract had been signed, and Everton went with just 17 players. They had 1 goalkeeper. They didn't have a reserve goalkeeper, and they actually only had 15 players because they took 2 of them who were injured. And it was a badly, from Everton's standpoint, it was a poorly organised competition. The first example was, even on the morning of the first game was in Montreal against Montreal Concordia, the Everton chairman, Mr. John Moores, he had to call the head of FIFA to get permission to play the game because the International Soccer League was not recognised by FIFA. And if you played in an authorized competition, therefore you couldn't play in in FIFA organized competitions, and he only got that granted at the last minute. I'll quickly go through and give you some taste of what the games were like. You mentioned that they were exhibition games. I think, in fact, they were far from exhibition games. When Everton toured in 1956, they played the all-star teams in the United States, and they played Aberdeen, the Scottish club, in a series of games in Canada. They were exhibition games. They were, the scores were 6-0, 8-0, something like that. These were very competitive games. The first game in Montreal was at the Molson Stadium, and I think the best way to describe it would be ugly. It seemed that the Canadian players had previously played hockey and weren't so adept at playing soccer. Everton were used to rough play. It's not like the Premier League of today when everybody falls over or feigns injury. Everton were used to matching people's physical nature, but the game was full of melees. 2 players were sent off and 1 was carried off with a broken leg, which shows you what kind of competition it was. A few days later, they played Kilmarnock at the again in Montreal, and that was just a routine win for Everton. And then they had to endure an 11-hour train journey from Montreal to New York, and they were booked into what can best be described as a DOS house. I don't know how you would describe, but maybe a flop house would be the American term for it, but it was certainly an unsuitable accommodation for professional athletes. I won't name the mention. The name of the hotel is mentioned in the book, but I don't think it's fair for me to mention it here. Anyway, the place was filthy, it was dirty, and it was certainly unacceptable. So they moved to the Paramount Hotel in Broadway, which unfortunately was 2 miles away from Central Park, where they were training. So they had to get the subway in their kit. So you can imagine there's 17 professional soccer players in the kit getting on the subway in Manhattan to travel the 2 miles to Central Park. After a while, of course, they realized that, they were embarrassed by this, so they decided to take taxis. The training facilities were poor. They had to play on a baseball field, and they couldn't play on a Saturday because the New York regulations, because it was a public park, forbid professional teams playing there on a Saturday. And the players themselves had a lot of free time because most of the fixtures in America were concentrated in a 2-week window. They played something like 4 or 5 games in a 2-week window, whereas, they were there for 5 weeks. So they had a lot of free time. I think that they all enjoyed themselves. When they actually started playing, they had easy games against Karlsruhe from Germany, comfortable wins. They had another very competitive game against Dynamo Bucharest, where 2 players were sent off. Then they played Bangu, which was from Rio de Janeiro. They were, Everton had played them the year before at Goodison Park, which is Everton's home, and that had been a fiercely competitive game. Everton were frustrated by the, let's call it the shenanigans of the Brazilian players, the diving and the sly fouls. And I gather that the game that they played at the Polo Grounds in New York was very similar. It was a bad-tempered game. Everton then played Besiktas, and that was a walkover. And the final game was against an American team called the Americans of New York, which was a 7-0 victory for Everton, and that was in Montreal. They then played. Everton came top of their section. And they had to return in the August, and they had to play, they were required to play against Dukla Prague. Dukla Prague were essentially the Czechoslovakian army team and the core of the Czechoslovakian national side. And 1 year later, the Czechoslovakian national side lost the World Cup final to Brazil. So they were a good team. They demonstrated that by hammering Everton by 7-2 in the first leg, and in the second leg they won 2-0. The board, when Everton got back, the chairman was somewhat distraught because he was still under the impression that British soccer ruled the world. He was a bit out of touch with actually what was going on. The report that they made to the board of directors at Everton wasn't very flattering. They said that the tour wasn't a very happy one. It was badly organised. There was poor accommodations, a lack of training facilities, and all the games were squeezed into one park. They did mention, of course, that they made £5,000, which sort of smoothed things over a little bit. The impact of the tour was that Everton started the new season badly, and it was blamed on the tour. They finished 4th when really they should have won it. The following year they did win it, and maybe an indication of how they felt about the tour is they never went back to North America for 24 years.
Yeah, it's all fascinating stuff, and I highly commend the book because in there you've got various covers from the game programs and literally game by game, sort of blow by blow. Some of those games very exceedingly interesting. A couple of things to unpack there. So, yeah, number one, the quote unquote New York Americans, right? That's arguably the sort of token United States offering, I guess, in this international soccer league. When, in essence, they're really, I mean, there was a very regional and very ethnically centric or focused quote unquote American soccer league, right? So I would imagine that team, if I'm not mistaken in my history, that was more of an assemblage of a, I guess you would call it an all-star or just assembled team specifically for this competition. So there is that. You also glanced over the other facility that was, so you mentioned a couple of games in Montreal, but also a lot of the games for the entirety of these 5 years of this tournament were centrally located in a fast-aging polo grounds. Maybe some thoughts about that, because clearly this was also being played in the height of the summer, which I'm sure the lads were not sort of tremendously used to. And New York summers can be very brutal, and it looks like more than a few of those games were quite intense in terms of heat and humidity, and not made better by a less than, shall we say, modern facility in the polo grounds.
Well, the game against Bangor that I mentioned, that was played in heat and humidity of 94 degrees, which, of course, the English and Scottish players were not used to. As for the polo grounds, of course, it was a massive stadium, but they only had something like 8,000 to 10,000 spectators there. So I think the turnout was pretty poor. When it came to the finals, which were played at the polo grounds, I think that there was more interest in the finals. There were, I think, maybe 12 to 20,000 fans showed up. That compares with when I mentioned earlier the 1956 exhibition tour. At that time, they only got a couple of thousand fans, maybe 2,000 if they were lucky.
Well, the money didn't hurt, right, I guess, but obviously the experience certainly scared them away, I guess, from coming back. So it's important to understand that this International Soccer League was, in essence, sort of a showcase with some competition, right? And these were on local television in New York in particular. It sort of remains sort of a lost treasure that we'd love to be able to scare up a video of that if it's ever found in somebody's garage or attic or basement. It did have sort of flashes of success, and it did introduce in top tier fashion some of the best players and some of the best teams around the world, but it also became sort of the kindling, I guess, for this thing called the North American Soccer League. As you guys well know, and our audience increasingly does, that in and of itself was an interesting sort of creation, because in 1967, there were not one, but two leagues. Actually, there were three, but they consolidated into two, that became essentially the beginnings of what then in 1968 became a combined North American Soccer League. But a primary part of one of those leagues, the United Soccer Association, was this, shall we call it, full importation of club teams from around the globe, similar to the ISL's setup, but with the, shall we say, odd translation into their domestic team city hosts, right? So you mentioned Bangor, and there's a bunch of other teams that were in the ISL that literally took on Los Angeles, for example. The Wolves, Wolverhampton, became the Wolves of Los Angeles, right? So this sort of weird translation of a full-fledged international team, lock, stock, and barrel, becoming named as a local affiliation of a city in the United States. I'm curious as to why Everton, and maybe I think I know the answer, why they weren't either invited or thought of to be part of this United Soccer Association, one of the two tributaries into the NASL, coming over to the United States and playing really a competitive thing to help create soccer in the United States. I'm guessing it was because of the trauma, I guess, of 1961.
Yeah, I think, as David alluded to, I think the experience in 1961 certainly meant that Harry Catterick, who was still Everton manager into the 1970s, he would have had no appetite for basically sacrificing a summer break and pre-season to go back to take Everton to the States under a different brand for another occasion. The clubs that did tend to do that from the UK, Stoke City, for example, who became the Cleveland Stokers interestingly featuring Roy Vernon, who had been with Everton in 1961 on the tour. Clubs like Stoke, they went away nearly every year in the post-season to basically to raise some cash. So Everton were known as the Mersey millionaires in this particular period of their history. They were effectively bankrolled by John Moores, the chairman, and the Littlewoods organisation. So there was no financial imperative for Everton to do this. So they didn't need the money, and I'm sure, according to the manager, they didn't need the hassle. So I don't think there was any chance of Everton crossing the Atlantic in 1967.
That didn't stop players, though, from, I'm guessing because it was so scantily referenced in this book, I'm guessing that really nobody from Everton decided to jump into the competing league, which was the rogue, non-FIFA sanctioned National Professional Soccer League in 1967. But when 1968 came, which was sort of this amalgamation of these two entities, and interestingly, for the first couple of years of the NASL, it even still borrowed this sort of whole importation thing still of pro teams from around the world and sort of, crowbarring them into domestic locations in the United States. Everton, like a lot of other clubs, certainly, and a lot of players, started over time to see that this North American Soccer League could be an option for them, either as an alternative to playing in Europe or perhaps as a supplement to playing into Europe. And no lack of players with Everton chops and background that ultimately came to this North American Soccer League circa 68 and onward.
Yeah, I think going as far back as 1968, that's probably the first sort of former Evertonian. A chap called Ray Veal went to the LA Wolves for a season. I think it was really into the 70s when you began to get the slightly more high-profile Everton footballers, and probably the mid-70s by the time you got players going directly from Everton to play over in the United States. And a good number of those we've managed to speak to as part of the research. I'm sure it became more attractive, especially once the whole thing with Pelé, etc., came onto the scene. And I think there was a bit of a boys' network developed. So there were English or British players over there or getting involved in the sort of management of teams, and then they were inviting their mates over. So it became very much a thing especially from the mid-70s onwards, and a lot of Everton players did make that journey.
Yeah, some great stories in here too, and this book is a treasure trove of them. These are names of the NASL who are well regarded and well remembered. For example, Jimmy Gabriel, right? Obviously, if you could pick somebody who was synonymous with soccer, with the Sounders in their original version in the North American Soccer League, some great memories there. But I mean, you also get into people like Jimmy Husband and his memories of this Memphis Rogues team, right? And I talk about an attempt to bring soccer to the masses, right? Memphis, Tennessee, not necessarily, even today, frankly, sort of what I would call a soccer hotbed, right? But also things like just the craziness of the NASL. We've talked about that on many different occasions with lots of folks, right? I mean, wet T-shirt contests and all kinds of wacky promotions and frankly, changing the rules, right? To make it appealing to the American fan. Some of those actually ideas could still, make their way back into the modern day game, right? So a points system, for example, that rewards scoring more goals, even if you're losing. That's not a bad thing. A 35-yard line as an offsides, right? Much more controversial. Shootouts, right? To eliminate ties. I just wonder if you sort of maybe collectively think about some of these commentaries and stuff. The way I read some of these memories in this book, as well as just generally in the conversations we've had with folks over the years who were part of this mixture, it was sort of kind of maybe a mix of wonderment and just intrigue, that it was kind of fun and different and not sort of I guess at the time in the 70s in particular, the British game, kind of dour and not sort of fun per se. The United States was kind of the antithesis of that, even though the future was not necessarily guaranteed here in this country.
Absolutely. I don't think I've spoken to a single former player when doing the research for this book with David and Darren who hasn't loved his time, and nobody has regretted going to play in North America, whether it's for a season, 2 seasons, or longer. And just whether it's the climate, the lifestyle, the money, of course, helps. It relatively lucrative compared to perhaps playing in England. There were downsides. The AstroTurf didn't do too many knees a favour, and the travel was something they commented on. But overall, all of them found it refreshing, a great lifestyle, a great thing to learn, and probably more relaxed, frankly, compared to that intense competitiveness that they would have had to face back in England. So players, I think all the ones that I spoke to, and I'm sure David will chip in too, they have nothing but warm memories of their time spent in the States. Terry Daracott, who was an Everton defender who went to Tulsa, and he had some wonderful stories, and just things that were so alien to the sort of British player, the singing of the national anthem, or sort of leading stars of Broadway coming and singing before or after games, or a guy who sort of climbs into a coffin on the centre circle and has it exploded, before kickoff. This isn't the stuff you were getting at Goodison Park or Old Trafford, or not yet anyway. Who knows? So yeah, it's amazing. And as you say, some of these things, the razzmatazz, it has sort of eventually come in maybe more diluted form over to Europe. So in some, a lot of ways, the NASL was ahead of its time.
Can I just add to that in the 70s, Britain was in a depression. I moved to the United States in the 70s, and it was an exciting country. Everything was new and everything was bright and big. And when I've spoken to the footballers, they hadn't seen anything like it. They hadn't seen the technology. America was years, decades maybe ahead of the United Kingdom at that time. And it was an exciting place to come to. It was an adventure. When I talked to Alan Ball, the famous World Cup winner in 1966, he had 2 spells in the United States. One was with the Philadelphia Fury, where he thought that was just like a vacation. They just had a great time off the pitch, all the adventures that they had in that neck of the woods. And the next team he played for was the Vancouver Whitecaps, and that was totally different. That was very competitive. I think that they won the championship when he was there, but everybody it was like playing in Britain. It was very, very intense.
Well, yeah, and the influx of British players, right, was very pronounced. And Everton certainly contributed to that. You mentioned the Fury, for example. That was a team only lasted 3 years, but was very much modeled in, I guess, either the English style or the English way of play, if not from a process and coaching perspective, certainly from a player perspective, right? And that wasn't unique to Philadelphia. There was a ton of teams that, if there was any sort of reliable source of players for the North American Soccer League, was absolutely coming from the UK. And I wonder, and maybe I think you get into this with some of the remembrances and stuff. There was almost sort of I call it a pipeline, right, of the unique nature of the NASL season, right, was that it was a late spring to relatively midsummer, right? It was pretty truncated, at least for the golden years, I guess. It did elongate a little bit, but it somewhat neatly played well with the league season in England and in Europe generally, where it provided a window of additional play, additional paycheck. I just wonder how that all sort of frankly worked, because at once that's mutually beneficial, but then again, if I'm loaning a player, say from Everton, or I'm granting permission to my player to come to the States to play, right, it's also a risk, right?
I agree. I think the established players thought of it as like a pension. It was their last big payday. And And there was a similar group of people who were the younger players who may not have made it to the first team at Everton, who came over and they played in the NASL. And they stayed. They became Americans. They went into coaching. So there were two groups of people who came over: the established stars, the marquee signings, and the journeymen, let's call them, who similarly have contributed a lot to the development of soccer in the States.
Yeah, I'm picking up on your question, Tim. I think relatively few Everton players were allowed to sort of go on a summer loan. I know that did happen with players at some other English clubs, but generally with the Everton players or players with Everton connections, they effectively left Everton to go and play in the States and would then return and play for another club in England. So I don't think it would be something that Everton would have encouraged, just sort of releasing their players for 3, 4, 5 months. It tended to be when they were coming towards the end of their Everton career that their next move was to go to the States.
Yeah, and maybe we can get to some of the names that sort of stand out from your investigation, your history, your interviews and stuff. I mean, I growing up and watching, being a Cosmos fan, fair disclosure, names like Alan Ball, right? Pretty well established Everton star, but he was a part of the Philadelphia Fury story, both as a player and as a coach, right? So somebody like a Peter Beardsley or even like Dave Clements, right? He was a New York Cosmos coach for some time, and interestingly, and probably most memorably, part of as a player and as a coach for the perhaps most garishly outfitted team of all time, the Caribou of Colorado, right? So I guess I'd love to get into some of the names that might be more known and or helpful to our audience, but also maybe a little bit of an insight as to some of those folks who stayed and decided to kind of root themselves in the United States and then ride with this game wherever it might go, and perhaps bring the beautiful game to the United States in a real substantial professional way.
Well, where do we start? Well, I'll start off with a couple, David, and then you can add some more. So you talked about
Alan. It's not a quiz, but I'm just curious to throw some names out there. I mean,
no, sure.
There are stories with all of them. And again, get the book, friends, because it gets really detailed. It's fantastic.
You talked about Alan Ball, who ended up at Vancouver. Well, you also had people like Roger Kenyon, Dave Thomas, two other notable Everton players of the 70s ended up there with Bally in British Columbia. Jimmy Gabriel, we touched on. Gary Jones, who was a mercurial winger at Everton in the mid-70s, never quite reached the heights he should have done. Well, he ended up at Fort Lauderdale having the time of his life with George Best and Gerd Muller. David, is that you want to chip in with a few as well?
No, you can imagine going to the bar with those guys.
I think the bar came to them. They had that was the wet t-shirt competition, and the ladies with pom-poms. It seemed that Fort Lauderdale was a very popular place. Asa Hartford went there, as Rob said. Gary Jones and Brian Kidd, who is obviously still in the game, went there. Other names were Bruce Rioch, who went to Seattle. Duncan McKenzie was in Tulsa, and as the Tulsa at that time was owned by Joe Maxmore's father. So there was a connection there. And one of my favorites is Steve Sargent. Steve Sargent went to Detroit, and he's still there.
Yeah, and we've talked to a lot of former players, and it's just interesting how for whatever reason they would wind up staying. But also, and we sort of alluded to this before, to a person, they all, fondly remember these sort of experiences, right? And maybe the paychecks might bounce, and maybe, they might be playing for one team one year and then another. But the grassroots stuff, right? A lot of great memories of, literally pitching in and lining the fields and going to local teams and organizations and trying to sort of grow the game from a grassroots perspective. It's almost like in some respects, almost like a new lease on life when you juxtapose that to where they came from in this, again, admittedly sort of bleak period of time in the English and European game.
Yeah, you make a good point there, Tim, about the a number of players said that in their contract they were obliged, if you want, to do outreach. So when they were playing for the North American teams, part of their job was to go out to local schools, community groups, etc., to do coaching and spread the word. Even though it's a contractual obligation, they all speak about it with great fondness. And I suppose it led some of them down that coaching path and led to a couple of them, like Steve Sargent, actually staying there and getting involved with the game. So again, that's something now that we talk about Everton in the community and lots of other clubs doing this, trying to become more involved in their community. Well, that kind of thing was happening in the mid-70s in the NASL. So again, that was something that really struck me as being ahead of its time and something that the players actually really bought into.
Let me ask you, and this is sort of a selfish question about the Cosmos, right? So I grew up as a fan of the team. Arguably, the major global brand that exported from the NASL. You could make the argument, as many soccer historians have, that they were sort of the sort of archetype for what became the sort of global super brand kind of concept that we sort of see today with the Chelseas and the Man U's of the world. Collectively, and there are a few folks like Dave Clements in the earlier days of the Cosmos experience, people like Bruce Wilson, who were nominally related to Everton as a trialist, and others. Was there any sort of thread of what their thoughts of this team were? Because I certainly remember back in the day, right, there was sort of you either were a pro Cosmos person or against them. And frankly, this is sort of a similar juxtaposition to this sort of ill-fated Super League, right? Where, it's you've got the haves and the have-nots, and the Cosmos, for lots of different reasons, were absolutely maybe the only real have of the NASL. I'm just wondering if you got any sense of the players' feeling about sort of this, if you will, super club in the NASL, if they felt that it was a good thing or a bad thing, or did they not care because they were just here having fun and enjoying themselves?
Can I answer that one?
Please.
As you well know, Ken Furphy, who was a player at Everton, he only played in the reserves. He managed the Cosmos
Absolutely
for a season. I talked to Clive Toy, who was I guess he was the chief executive of the Cosmos for several years. He takes credit for recruiting Pele and Franz Beckenbauer.
Yes, former guest on this show. Fantastic and still well at it.
It's a pleasure to talk to somebody like that. And I'm glad that you've had him on the show and that, his story has been told. I gathered from talking to Clive that the Cosmos was great for the game, but it also destroyed the game. I'm talking the game, I mean the NASL. By the Cosmos bringing in the superstars, the Pelés and the Beckenbauers, it resulted in other teams doing that, and other teams couldn't afford to do it. So they brought in the big names, the Cruyffs and the Nayskins and the likes of George Best. But it really had significant financial impact on them in the long term.
So I want to get into sort of why it took Everton so long to come back to the United States, not until 1985, which is interesting when you look back at it, because Everton had obviously a role to play, if you will, in what ultimately became the beginnings of this North American Soccer League, and obviously within it as well, player by player, coach by coach. But interestingly, the team itself didn't come back until literally the NASL was it wasn't even around in 85. It was kind of burning embers, if you will. But before I get to that sort of 1985 sort of part of it, there was this thing in the early 80s, maybe late 70s, early 80s, within the NASL called the Transatlantic Challenge Cup, in which the Cosmos were always featured. And it was a round robin in-season tournament of sort of international games. The Chicago Sting were part of it. The Seattle Sounders were part of it, et cetera. Teams from all over. I think Man U was part of it, and various teams sort of came over from I think is mostly Europe, but also South America. In your investigations and your conversations, did you ever hear about this, or was Everton maybe even considered, or is this something that's new to you?
I've heard of it. I gather that the European teams only played a couple of games in the season. They didn't play all of the participants in it. When it came to Everton, I don't think they even considered it. At that time, they were traveling the world. They've always been great pioneers and trailblazers. In 1905, they went to Argentina to teach the Argentinians how to play the game. But they went to Australia, Mauritius, South Africa, Asia. They went on tours everywhere. They just didn't return to the United States.
How then 85? Why come back, especially when the NASL essentially had collapsed? You really had like two teams, really, or embers of teams that were even willing to kind of come back after the collapse of 84. Maybe you can set the tone for the 85 tour. What was that all about? Why were they coming back? And just that maybe some of the scenarios around that. I mean, Bruce Wilson makes an appearance, right, with this team that was no longer the Toronto Blizzard, for example.
Rob, let me, if I may respond to this one. The reason why we took part, the reason why they had the competition was the Canadians national team had qualified for the World Cup, or was in the process of qualifying for their only time for the World Cup. And of course, the players didn't have anywhere to play. They didn't play for regular teams. The NASL had collapsed. So they decided that they would form two teams. One was INEX, which was the Blizzard, and the other was the Canadian national team. They asked Everton to come over at the last minute. And the reason why Everton came over is because of the behaviour of the fans from our neighbours at Heysel Stadium, and the loss of 39 Italian football fans meant that English teams were banned from Europe. And the only competitive opposition they had was in Canada. So Everton were then the league champions, the English league champions. They were delighted to come over and play. And actually, I went to both of those games. I lived in Houston at the time, and I remember those two games. And what I remember a lot about it was the number of Everton fans, the number of expats in Toronto who'd showed up for those games. I think that we drew 1-1 with INEX, and we beat the Canadian national side 1-0.
Yeah, a lost treasure, certainly, that fits very well into our genre here, is this INEX Canada thing, which I think most people don't recognize or remember, that was basically the ongoing embers of what was the Toronto Blizzard. I know the Cosmos attempted on their own, keeping their name, to have a series of exhibitions in 1985 as well, and that didn't go very well for too long. But Toronto, obviously a very cosmopolitan town, always been a strong soccer town too, mostly from ethnic sort of origins and stuff. But it seems ironic, right, that they would come back, Everton, to play when there really wasn't much sort of left to kind of tour with. I would imagine they would have probably been asked by the Cosmos to be part of their exhibition exploits in 85 too. I find it hard to believe they wouldn't have been asked.
It all happened at the last minute. I think it was about 10 days before they didn't know they were going to be banned from Europe. I think they'd already organised tours, pre-season tours in Austria. And, of course, they couldn't play in Europe. So it was the only, I gather it was the only outlet for them. And I said everything was organised in 10 days.
Well, let's maybe sort of round the third base here and sort of slide into home, as sort of a capstone here. So, we kind of love to sort of delve into and sort of roll around in sort of those things that were forgotten. But there's no question that Everton as a soccer franchise has been very much part of the weave, the fabric, the sewing, if you will, of the professional game here in the United States. And it's also pretty clear that as the 2000s sort of rolled around and onward, and as we argued early in the conversation, perhaps even more still to come, the touring, the brand, it's certainly been much more pronounced over the last decade or two. And I'm just curious as to sort of where you sort of see Everton going in the years ahead as it relates to the American game. Clearly, there are folks who have made major contributions to the game here. And clearly there's an appetite, and it continues to be a source of contention, right, about bringing teams from other lands here in the United States for, the Euro snob crowd, shall we say, right? They don't look at MLS as being highly competitive, and they get excited for things like the International Champions Cup and all that kind of stuff, right? But of course, the cynic would say, well, it's in the middle of the off season for these clubs. Do they bring their biggest powerhouse lineups? Do they take these competitions seriously? Is this a true showing of the best of these teams, or is this just, a calendar thing where it's just, at least something to satiate the fans and expose people to the brand, even if it is, in the midst of the off season for these clubs. So I guess the question in there is, where do you see Everton and the American game now and in the years ahead? Obviously the players of the past, who've made their contributions and continue to be ambassadors for the team and the game. But where do you see it going, this relationship?
Do you want me to answer that, Rob?
Yep, certainly, David.
You've got to remember that Everton played in the MLS All-Star game not too long ago. And in the while David Moyes was manager, we came over here 7 times. We toured on 7 occasions. Really well organized, tremendous support. I mean, I went to the games in Houston, and there was something like 2,000 or 3,000 Everton fans had come over from the UK to watch, which it was called the Texas Cup. There was essentially exhibition games, and they made a lot of friends. When I look at what Everton is in the United States, I'd say it was the Leonard Cohen of football clubs. It's an acquired taste. It's a special club. It's a special club, and where people are very proud to be Evertonians. I have neighbours here in Arizona who support Manchester United and Manchester City. That they just go with the wind. Once you're an Evertonian, you're an Evertonian for life. I know that's the same with many clubs, but with the traditions of our club, that's what makes us very special. We're very, very loyal. We go through the ups and downs of it all.
Rob, your thoughts. What do you think? I mean, it seems like Everton is really trying to, at some point relatively soon, to kind of take that next step, that next level, and maybe, as I hinted at earlier, tap into that history, right? And this book comprehensively certainly is a great case for it, right? You guys can help this club really pull out story after story, personality after personality, contribution after contribution, and with a authenticity, extend that brand, perhaps even more, more honestly and genuinely, maybe than some of these other more well-known clubs.
Yeah. Well, I think David made a very valid point before that we're playing catch up, and we'll probably never will catch up with your Barcelonas, your Manchester Uniteds, your Liverpools. I think we have to accept that. That said, there's definitely room for us to sort of expand our presence, get more people on board, learn about our rich heritage. But a few people I spoke to when researching the book made the point that the best way to get more supporters is for us to win things. So all the outreach, all the developments, hopefully more affiliations with clubs and setups in North America are all very valid and something we should do. But the thing that will really help us develop is just to win some competitions, be that cups or leagues back here in England and Europe. So it's absolutely right what we're doing in terms of outreach and developing in the States and Canada. But we need to make sure that we're also focusing on our core business, which is winning stuff, which will draw in maybe the casual fans or get people who are curious to learn more about us due to our success, and then they will tap into our rich heritage and hopefully become fans for life.
Yeah, look, I think it's a really good point, because I think too there's the there's a sophistication that is slowly but surely gaining steam in this country, right? And we can debate on another episode the quality and the legacy of Major League Soccer, right? It has its faults and its single entity and this codification of sort of the American way of doing pro sports, and did that have a sort of an effect, sort of the Super League debacle and all that. But, again, it also is 25 years strong, right? Which is how many years now longer than the NASL ever lasted, right? And, there need to be some support mechanisms to kind of keep this game sort of going. And we, too, have to grow and win some regional and maybe championships and maybe some deeper runs in the World Cup and all that stuff years and years after that was promised here. But that acquired taste, right, as people become, it's an embarrassment of riches, at least here in the States, right? In that we can watch just about every Premier League match now, all of the top leagues around the world. That certainly puts a lot of pressure on Major League Soccer to kind of figure out a way to play and be a part of that landscape, right? And maybe never, ever really being at that level, century down the road, perhaps we could talk about that. But, a club like Everton, right? To the thinking fan, to the fan who doesn't want to be sort of, just a generic follower of just the big brand name and all of that, right? Number one, what fun is there in that? Number two, there's also a recognition that there are dozens and hundreds of clubs all around the world that are more than just a big brand name that's globally exported and have the biggest names and the biggest salaries, right? And that's also, frankly, part of the beauty of the game, the fabric of the game, which is, I think, now being reflected in this major rejection of this, at least for now, this Super League concept that is just inherent in the history of the game, where it came from, and the challenge, the struggle, not everybody wins all the time. On any given day, a team can, and you want to root for some of those players, right? And some of those teams and some of those situations. And I think what I see in Everton is a club that has been there through thick and thin, always competitive, occasionally reaching the glories of championships and cups. And frankly, is without the Evertons of the world, you wouldn't, a lot of the great competition in the Premier League wouldn't sort of exist. And that's, in many respects, to your point, that people can identify with that. And that's, to market the team with some of those aspects, and then layering in what I think, hopefully, through this book and this conversation, is a very rich and largely probably unknown contribution in history to the game in the United States. I think that's a winning marketing formula.
Yes, Tim, I agree with you, but I think you the way in which you described the club then as if we were a mediocre organisation. And in fact, I would think of us as being a sleeping giant. I think in the last in the last 5 years, there's been a revolution at Everton, thanks to Mr. Mashiri. You may not know this, but the majority of the people in the city of Liverpool support Everton. Everton is the type of team that they support. It goes with the culture of the city, which I can assure you is a fine city. Everton are building this magnificent stadium on the banks of the River Mersey. A new stadium, which was designed by an American, and that should be built in the next 3 years. So I think you're going to see a tremendous change in when it comes to Everton as a brand, as you call it. And whilst, as Rob said, we may not catch up with some of the national brands, but we're certainly going to be a bigger force in the future, and rightly so.
And last question, with or without the Super League, do you care about that? Does it come back in some way, shape, or form? I sadly think that idea, that concept, will rear its ugly head again. And you wonder where at Everton fits in all of that, because you're clearly aspiring to be that going forward, or at least be at that sort of top higher tier. Seems like a double-edged sword.
I think, as we touched on, I think there will be some form of reform in terms of European football. It might not be a breakaway league. It might be that these big clubs manage to use their leverage to get UEFA to change the format more of the Champions League to guarantee them more guaranteed places or guaranteed monies. So I'm sure things will continue to evolve in terms of European soccer. As for Everton, we need to be in there. We need to be high enough in the league to be competing so that we actually get invited next time if there is another sort of breakaway formed. It did raise a truffle with a lot of people when this league was announced the other week, with 6 clubs from England, one of which was Spurs. So you have this sort of new Super Champions League with a team who hadn't won the English league competition in 50 years this year, whereas Everton, we last won it back in the mid to late 80s. So we should be up there. So next time there is a breakaway league, we should at least be in the mix to be considered, even if we don't accept the invitation.
I think at this time, Rob, I would say that we're 7th. We're the ones who's on the fringes of this Super League. And you and I know that Everton have won more titles than Chelsea and Tottenham put together, more than Chelsea and Manchester City put together. We just need to improve our current team, win things, and I think our rightful place would be in the Big Six. I say that as a football fan, not just as an Evertonian. When I don't know who picked those 6 teams, but you'd have question marks over, certain members of the 6, whether they are have been the dominant teams in the English game.
All right, our thanks to Rob and David, and we're sorry we couldn't also include Darren Griffiths in the conversation, but those are the 3 guys behind the book. That's fascinating. It's greatly detailed. And if you consider yourself a fan of the sport and its history in North America, even if you're not an Everton fan or know nothing about Everton or the Premier League, this is a tremendous contribution to the historical tomes of the sport, and you'll find lots of great nuggets about the NASL. A little bit of the ASL is in there, some MISL stuff in there. Certainly, the International Soccer League is in there. What came of the NASL afterwards, and a lot of MLS too, of course. As the book is called Toffee Soccer, Everton and North America. It is published by our pals at deCoubertin Books. It is available, I believe, as of June 10th, depending on when you're listening to this. If it's before that date, when you hear this, order it from our links at goodseatsstillavailable.com. I'm sure you'll be able to find it at Amazon or various other places where good books are found. And pre-order it, of course. If you're listening to it after June 10th, why not order it immediately right this very moment? Again, goodseatsstillavailable.com. That's the convenient place to find anything related to any episode that we've ever done, including the episodes themselves. Just bookmark that, and if you missed something or for whatever reasons the show didn't show up in your feed, well, there you go. You always have that as a backstop for you, and that's where you can find all of our social media feeds and email addresses and all that kind of stuff. We're on Twitter, of course, at Good Seats Still, on Instagram at Good Seats Still Available. There's a Facebook page devoted to us, too. If you want to send us email, we're at hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. And on the website, you can subscribe to our little weekly email newsletter where we kind of give you a tip sheet on what's going to be the episode coming up for the week ahead. And like I said before, too, when you buy books or other forms of media from our website, you're often, not always, but often taken to places like Amazon, and we get a piece of referral love, not very much, but a little bit. So if you do want to buy a book or something from one of our guests, by all means, that's the way you can help support the show, the best way, by doing that. Let's see, what else? Our thanks, of course, to the good Dr. Jerry Payne. Can't do this show without him. Thank you, kind sir, for your production extraordinaire this week. And, geez, I don't know what else, but we appreciate your listening as always, thanks so much, and we'll see you next week. Probably not with soccer. I think we've given you 3 straight weeks of soccer. We'll give you something else next week. Look forward to that, and take care, everybody. Bye-bye.